My reading is from Matthew chapter 26, and I'll be reading from verse 17 to 29. Perhaps maybe take it all the way to verse 30. And I'm reading from the NIV version, and it reads as follows. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, 'My appointed time is near. I am going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me.' They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, 'Surely you don't mean me, Lord?' And another version says, Is it I, Lord?" was the question of the disciples. Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." And Jesus answered, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat. This is my body, which was broken for you." Then he took the cup and went, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And the hymn that they were singing comes from the Hillel. The Hillel was made up of some hymnal, and the Hillel and the songs that they were singing as it relates to verse 30 was Psalm 113 and Psalm 118. That is, scholar says, after the last meal, they would sing those hymns, Jesus and the disciples. When you consider the writer Matthew, there's often scholars that look at the background of the writer, and we know that Matthew was a Jew and he's writing to a Jewish community. And his main goal in writing to them is to, as he penned down this book, is to convince them and to make an argument that Jesus is the Messiah. He even goes as far as using more than 50 references in order of the Old Testament to convince the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. And when you consider the book and you continue to read it, and some scholars would say that it was not only the Jews but the Gentiles as well. And there might be a bias from Matthew as he writes this book, because why? There's layers on this book that we perhaps need to just kind of reflect upon before I go to my application. Some scholars says that the challenge and the need for the Jewish Christians was that they were in conflict with the Pharisaic religious movement, and the conflict transpired from the fact that they thought that they had judicial but also theological influence. There was a concern there, and so Matthew is pointing this out specifically because as he would appeal in his book for them in relation to the idea of discipleship and disciple making. And we see that the rabbis of the day used to make a lot of disciples, and so Matthew's idea behind appealing to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, more than that, was to point out that they also need to become disciples of the Savior. And so that's the first layer. But if you go deeper into the book, you would see that Jesus was going to use his own life to unpack really this idea of the Passover and the lamb that was slain. And in this culture and in this context, they had to go to the temple and slay the lamb, and then they had to bring it to the house. But there's a spiritual significance there, because why Jesus in this book would also in a very dramatic way tell us about the destruction of the temple, but there's a symbolic language as we look at the lamb that was slain. And so as Matthew continued to write this book, and therefore my title tonight that I have placed upon this text is the price for inclusiveness, or the cost of inclusiveness. And the reason for that is because I think in Matthew's writing, he realized as he reflects upon Christ, and as he looks into the second layer of this book, which the second layer is simply in the Passover, which happened in the book of Exodus, where we see that the reflection of really the Passover was to share a meal, and in the culture and in the context of where we have just read, we would see that the Jewish people had a custom of inviting family members, and they would usually be 6 or they would usually be 12, and they would share a meal. And the meal would have been made out of bitter herbs, it would have been made out of nuts, and it would be made out of vegetables. And so there's significance in Matthew pointing that out as he would squarely land his argument on Christ, the Savior. But not only that, he would point out that he came not only to die for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles, as we know that the Gentiles rejected the Messiah, and therefore in Matthew's book he's writing that the idea of Jesus is to go beyond just the Jewish community. Quickly, when you look at Matthew chapter 10, it is Jesus that's saying to disciples that go unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Do not go into the way of the Samaritans, of the Canaanites. And so in chapter 15, we realize there's a lady that comes up to Jesus, and she said, Lord, my daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. And so the disciple says, Lord, why is she crying after us? Send her away. And Jesus said, it is not me to give the children's bread to the dogs. And the lady said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat from the crumbs of the master's table. And Jesus says, oh woman, thou hast great faith. And you realize that Jesus' mission was calling for faith. Even in the disciples, as they would journey with him, his mission was about faith. was about believing in him. And let me just digress a little bit and say that it is a sad thing that when we look into the churches and the ministries of today, we realize that the idea of faith has been tied to cars, and it has been tied to houses, and it has been tied to whether you can get a promotion, and it has been tied to whether you can come out of debt. But I realize, listen, if you are going to live a victorious life, if you are going to live a life that God has called us for, and if you are going to make it through the challenging times, it is not a car and a house and money that can help you and deliver you. It is the faith in Jesus Christ and who he is that builds your faith, that would be able to sustain you. And so that is not what is only calling the disciples, but it's calling us to that as well. And so Matthew is going to be intentional about this inclusive idea. This inclusive message, but the reason why I place the cost of the inclusion, because I realize that inclusion often is not easy. Inclusion, it has diversity. Inclusion have different shapes. Inclusion have different colors. And therefore, if you're going to allow for inclusion, it's going to be cost. When you consider Matthew, one of the things that he does intentionally, and I'm heading towards my text, as I would also make the application and then take my seat. It is intentional of Matthew when you go to chapter 1 into the genealogy, that you would see that he would while he would list a number of honorable people and Jews, he comes and then in the genealogy he includes Tamar, and he includes Rahab the harlot, and he includes David and Bathsheba, because very early on he wanted the Jews to understand, to say that, listen here, that this salvation, this Messiah is not exclusive for the Jews alone, but this Messiah is for the Gentiles as well. And so where we have read, a few chapters away, we would see Sunday we experienced and celebrated Palm Sunday. And there are those that would say that this is the night that Jesus went with the disciples in the upper room to go and celebrate the Passover. But this would not just be another Passover. This would not just be a moment to reflect. And so in Bethany, there would be many families that would meet on this same night, and they would celebrate the Jews. They would celebrate it in remembrance of where they came from. But in the house that Jesus was in, he was going to give the disciples a revelation of what he is called for, and he's going to use the Passover meal to actually embody what it means and what is his purpose as he looked a few days away to the cross. Matthew is careful not to give the Jews the impression that they can sing the song, mine, 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 Jesus is mine. And in his writing, he's pointing it out. And in this specific text, I believe there's certain points that we can look into that makes us realize that Matthew was intentional about the inclusiveness. Jesus sitting with the disciples, and while they were sitting and partaking in the meal that symbolically reflected the journey and the redemption of Israel. And it is during this meal that he declares that one of you is going to betray me. And the disciples immediately respond and said, Lord, is it I? And Jesus does not answer directly, but he speaks generally. And then Judas is going to ask, Lord, is it I? And he responds to Judas. The first thing that we see here is that after Jesus has been ministering with these men for so many years, and they have seen him heal people, and they have seen him deliver people, and they have seen him do wonderful things, and the preachings and the feeding of the multitudes, and he comes at this meal and declare, one of you is going to betray me. Can you imagine what it must be like when you have fed someone, you looked after them, you taught them everything you knew, you poured your life into them just for them to come and betray you? Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I'm not only talking about Jesus, I'm talking about you and me. And as much as we saved and we in the church, oftentimes it's not easy when it comes to your children and you have done everything for them and they disappoint you. Have done everything in the relationship and you've given of yourself and you thought, oh, he's going to appreciate me, only to come and divorce you. And you said, how can it happen? Because I have poured my life into this. And oftentimes, those whom we serve and love, they betray us. Imagine Jesus comes to this very conclusion, that he will be betrayed. Not by strangers, by the very people who he poured himself into. Now, I know I'm not as saved as some of you are, but I would be mad if someone that I've poured in everything, that I've made sacrifices and that I've done so much for them, and they've been a journey with me, and they come to know me, and they've sat under my teachings, I would be mad that they would want to betray me. How do you handle those who betray you? How do you handle those who lie about you? How do you handle those who hurt you and manipulate you? How do you handle it? It's not easy, especially when you've poured yourself into them. And they do what everyone else would do. I said, Lord, is it me? There seems to be, when you look at this question, Lord, is it I? The disciples ask, Lord, is it I? Judas ask. You have the disciples reflecting on this question, and you have Judas reflecting on the same question. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Judas has become for us in the church an image that is irreplaceable. An image that is almost beyond redemption. Nobody gave or give them their child's name Judas in hospital. In fact, if you go to the Sunday school and you ask them who want to be Mary, the names would go up. Who want to be Jesus? Many hands would go up. Who want to be Mary? Everybody's hands go up. And who wants to be this one and that one? But when you come and said who want to be Judas, nobody put their hands up. Because Judas have become an image for us, ladies and gentlemen, that nobody wants to be. Judas represents for you and for me that child that is on drugs. Judas represents for you and me the family member who he cannot stand and I can't forgive him for what he has done for me. Judas represents the person who abused me. Judas represent the ones that said they loved me, but they used me. Judas represented. So the self-righteous disciples said, surely, Lord, not I. And Jesus gave a vague conclusion about them. But then Judas, he responded to Judas. And so we look into these kind of two groups of people that have a different representation. It is Walter Brueggemann, the German theologian, that said these words, and I quote, he says, in regards to is it I, Lord, he says it is too embarrassing to name and own one's own deep failures. As long as they are unvoiced, we may be allowed to pretend it's not us. The disciples pretended. And so as I hasten to a close and connect the other 2 points, because I had 3, that the first one is that there's a place for betrayal at the table. The second one is that when we look into this, the disciples, now this is what gets me about the disciples, because why? Nobody wants to be Judas, and we know Judas is the betrayer, but these other disciples that Jesus didn't so directly respond to, this was the disciples that argued and fight who must be first and who must be last. These are the disciples that has been saying to Jesus, send the multitudes away. These are the disciples. Jesus asked them, who do men say I am? They fumbled over their words. These are the disciples, ladies and gentlemen, that Peter would deny him. Mark would run away naked in the Garden of Eden. The other 9 don't even write one word about Jesus or testify about him. So if I look at it, Judas is not the only one. Judas is not the only one. But it's true what Walter Brueggemann says. If I don't name my own deep failures, as long as they are unvoiced, I can pretend like it's not me. Because Jesus didn't voice their challenges. They could pretend like they are still fine. And Judas is the one with the problem, because why? His issues were voiced. And oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, that is you and that is me. Because why? If our issues and our deep failures are not voiced, we can get to a place where we look at others and their failures and their disappointments. Everyone knows Judas is going to betray him at the table, while Peter is going to deny him. And this is what Jesus loved. As I move to a close, as I try to just bring all of these things together. So Jesus, as he observed what was happening, you had disciples that thinks they self-righteous. You have Judas that's going to betray me. And how is he going to make them understand this lesson of the cost of inclusiveness? How is he going to teach you and me about the cost of inclusiveness? Because the message of the cross, ladies and gentlemen, it's a message that has a cost to it. It is a message that there was blood, and it was violence, and it was vicious. This was not a fairy tale story. This was a story that had a cost to it. He says to them, come around the table. Verse 26, he says, the Bible says he took the bread and he broke it. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to the disciples that they must eat. And the Bible said in the same way, he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, inclusive. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many of the forgiveness of their sins." Let me give you my concluding point, and then I'm going to make this point and take my seat. When he says in verse 29, "I will not drink of this cup again until I get to my Father in heaven," Jesus had a desire that all of them would be there. In fact, scholars says he made a vow that he would not. And so this is where I wanted to land this sermon, the cost of inclusion. Jesus is the one that will be broken. Jesus is the one whose blood will be shed. In fact, in this text, they point to Isaiah 53 that talks about what happened to Jesus during the crucifixion. And so Jesus symbolically do what he will embody with his own flesh. Broke the bread, he said, "Eat, this is for you." The blood, he says, "Drink." He's saying to them that this is what it's going to cost me. My life on the cross, this is what it's going to cost me. The road to Golgotha, the shame and the hurt and the blood and the whooping and the nails and the spat in his face and the slaps. He says, "Listen, this is what it's going to take for me as I break the bread and as I give you this cup to drink." He says, "Listen, yeah, this is what it's going to take for me." But that is not what excited me. What excited me as I take my seat is he looked at Peter. He says, "Peter, I know you're going to betray me, but eat. This is my body that was broken for you." He says, "Drink, Peter. I know you're going to betray me. This is my blood that was shed for you." He looked at Mark, he says, I know you're not loyal, you're going to run the minute they come for us. He says, "Eat, Mark, I know you're going to be disloyal to me." He says, "Drink." Judas, some scholars said Judas left before, but he was part of them. What was happening there, even in his absence, didn't exclude him. And then the other 9, Andrew and the others, he gave each one of them. And this is where I wanted to go with this. Is that even though he knew they're going to betray him, even though he knew the ones that were sitting around him in the table was going to be disloyal to him, they're going to run, they're going to leave him alone, they're going to deny him Peter 3 times, and the others don't even want to do anything. They're not even going to write anything in the Bible about this Jesus. He says, "Listen, yeah, I know it. But the reason why I said, here's my bread and here's the cup, it's because I want to see you in heaven when I drink this cup again. I do not want to leave you behind. He says, listen here, even though you've hurt me, even though you've disappointed me, even though you've done these type of things, he says, listen here, the cost that I have to pay is to still forgive you. And this is the point that I want to make. How many of us here, you have been hurt? You've been disappointed. They've lied about you. There were family arguments. You have unforgiveness. And Jesus says, listen here, if you're going to follow me, you must deny yourself and pick up your cross. He says, listen here, if you're going to follow me, you need to do what I did. Because why? I looked at them and said, listen here, even though you hurt me, the cost of including you in heaven is that I need to pray for you. I need to encourage you. I need to invite you to church. I need to love you as my enemy. I need to love you when you've hurt me and disappoint me, and the children that disappoint us, those disappointments that you've had perhaps maybe in family or at work. He says, listen, there's a cost. You cannot love who you want to if you follow me. He says, you cannot choose who you forgive if you follow me. Because Jesus said, no, they were all there, but I said to them, eat, this is my body. Think just because I want to see you in heaven, I don't want to make it alone there. I want to see you. Even though you've hurt me, I want to see you there. Even though you've disappointed me, I want to see you there. And God is saying, listen, as we go through this Passion Week, as we look at the cost of inclusion is that you would love those that is unlovable and forgive those that's unforgivable, and that you would love everybody because there's a cost for including them to go to heaven. And I was thinking about faith. If you don't have faith, you cannot make it. I'm wondering how many of the people who hurt you do you desire to see in heaven? I'm wondering how many that disappoint you do you desire to see in heaven? Jesus says, I know you've betrayed me, you're going to backstab me, but I still desire to see you in heaven, because the cost of inclusion is that I must forgive you in spite of my hurt. I need to accept you and love you in spite of it. And so tonight, as we look at the cost of inclusion, we're going into the Passover. And every year, I said, Lord, every year we go into Easter, probably with the same attitude. We probably do the same things. We probably continue just with the same. And I said, Lord, there must be something that we stand still before. And he says, this is what you need to stand still before. He says, there's a cost for inclusion. Because I don't only want you to bring your cousin who you like, I want you to bring the one you don't like. He says, I don't want you only to pray for the sister that you have issues with, that you're nice with. I want you to pray for the sister that you have issues with. I don't only want you to pray for the worker at work that you are nice and you have lunch with. I want you to pray for the one that's treating you nasty as well. Because why? There's a cost to include them in my kingdom.